Thank you, Meg, and thank you all for singing. That was great. I'm so glad to be here this morning. Glad to have a good crowd today on Easter Sunday. You know, one of the things that ministers talk about is the fact that the churches are full on Christmas and Easter, and where is everybody the rest of the time? You know, it's like some people only know two stories. They know the birth story, and they know the resurrection story. They don't know anything else. But I guess if you're only going to come to church 2 days a year, that's 2 pretty good days a year. You know. We're here from Park Road Baptist Church this morning. A number of our folks have come and joined. I'm glad y'all are here, so thank you for joining us today. I told them that I love to come to Hope Chapel and be here with you, and I wanted them to come and be here, so I appreciate some of our folks from Park Road joining us this morning. For a sermon today, I wanted to look at John chapter 20. It's page 882. And when I went through John chapter 20, there were about 14 sermons that I wanted to preach. And I figured since some people only come to church on Easter Sunday, maybe I'd get in a couple extra sermons for you on Easter Sunday morning. I'm not going to preach all 14 of these sermons, okay? But what I want to do this morning is read through the text of the resurrection of Jesus from John's Gospel, and I'm going to stop along the way and make some comments. Each of those places I stop, you could write a whole sermon on, okay? So let's read. I will read the text and then stop and make some comment this morning as we read. This is a beautiful story, a wonderful story, and there's so much in it that we can get out of it. I've said to my congregation, it's interesting. My dad was a pastor. I've been going to church my whole life. I've been reading the Bible my whole life. And it's so interesting to me that every time you pick up the Bible, even if it's a story you've read 1,000 times, you get something new out of it. And so when I was going through this story, all these things jumped out at me about this wonderful story about Mary going to find to the tomb, going to the garden tomb that morning. And she was going there to anoint the body of Jesus after he had been crucified and laid in the tomb. And you know what she found. We're going to read the story here this morning, and I'll stop it along the way. Early on the first day of the week, Sunday is the first day of the week. It's why Christians worship on Sunday. Jews worship on Sabbath, Saturday. But Christians worship on Sunday, the first day of the week, because Jesus was resurrected on the first day of the week. While it was still dark, earlier the week Mary got up and she went to the tomb. Who was at the tomb that morning? Just Mary. Where were the men? Yeah, asleep, sitting around. They were gone. Mary was at the tomb that morning. You know, there are a lot of women who were around Jesus throughout his ministry. There are 5 Marys named in the Bible. Mary, the mother of Jesus, 4 other Marys. And we read in the Gospels that Salome was a woman, and Joanna and Susanna, and these women were part of Jesus's friends, part of his disciples, and they were with him from the beginning, and they were with him at the end. Thank God for the women. Yeah, for their faithfulness to Jesus. Mary Magdalene saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb, so she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Now that's important. We're going to get to that in a minute. What happened to Jesus? Mary didn't know. The other disciples didn't know. They didn't understand. They thought somebody had come and taken Jesus out of the tomb. They didn't understand. Then Peter and the other disciples set out and went toward the tomb. And the two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. It was a foot race to Jesus, right? How fast do you run to Jesus? We could write a whole sermon about that, right? Who's going to get there first? You know, Paul says, "Do you not know that in a race all runners run, but only one gets the prize?" Who's going to get there first? Amy and I lived in Yellowstone National Park one summer. Beautiful, incredible place out in Wyoming. And we did a lot of hiking that summer. But you know, there are a lot of bears in Yellowstone. And so we did a lot of reading about bears and what to do if you come across a bear in the woods. Well, the best advice we got when you're in the woods hiking and there are bears, to make sure not that you can outrun a bear, but make sure you can outrun at least one person in your hiking party. You understand? You don't have to outrun the bear. You just don't want to be the slowest one in the hiking party. So this morning, Peter and the disciple that Jesus loved had a foot race to the tomb. And the other disciple got there first, but he stopped. He didn't go in first. He bent down and looked in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. And Simon Peter came following him and went into the tomb. And he saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. Now, I think this is fascinating. I preached a sermon on this a few years ago. They looked in the tomb, and the wrappings that they had put Jesus' body in were there, and the wrapping around his head was neatly rolled up and placed there on the tomb. You know how this worked, folks, was when somebody died in this day, they would take the body and they would place it in a tomb. They would place it on a stone slab. And on that slab, the body would deteriorate. And then if you were a person of means, if you had somebody who looked out after you, after the body had deteriorated, they would come and they would gather the bones. And they would take the bones and they would put them in a box called an ossuary. And then the box would be placed somewhere else. And so the tomb where the disciples went was, they call it a sarcophagus, which literally means flesh eater. Because they would put the body there and the body would decompose and then they would gather the bones. And so that's what they were looking at, this stone slab where they would lay the body. I think it's fascinating that if you read the story, it was like Jesus was resurrected, and what was the first thing he did? He folded up his clothes. I don't know if this was like this in your house, but in my house, when I got up in the morning, my mama said to me, "Make up your bed." I had to make up my bed every day in my house. And, you know, some people don't understand that, because you make up your bed, you get out of it, you make up your bed, you come back at night, what do? You unmake it and get back in it. Well, it's like, why would we make up our bed? That's a crazy thing. But my mama believed in making up your bed. And so to this day, I have to make up my bed. Now, a lot of times I get out of the bed before my wife does, and she doesn't always make up the bed. So when I go back home at night, you know, I just about have to make my bed up before I can unmake it and get in it. Because my mama taught me to make up my bed. I think it's really curious. If the resurrection of Jesus is what the church has said it is, Jesus was resurrected, and what did he do? First thing he did, he made up his bed. I just think that's a fascinating detail, and I'm not sure what to make of it, but it makes me wonder if we ought to think about the day-to-day things being really important. Making up our bed, taking care of the day-to-day things. You know, resurrection doesn't mean you ought not worry about all that stuff. Resurrection gives you a new lease on life so you can get up and make up your bed, go to work, do the things you're supposed to do. You know, just because resurrection doesn't mean you ought not do that. And so Jesus took the time to make up his bed. I just think that's fascinating. So the other disciple had outrun Peter and gotten there first, but he had stopped at the entrance. Peter was the one that went in first, and then the other disciple, who reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed. He saw and believed, but what did he believe? He saw, but he rose? Well, it just said that Mary came to the tomb and she saw that there was no body there, and she went back and told Peter and this other disciple that somebody had come and taken the body of Jesus. So they didn't believe he rose. They thought somebody had taken the body of Jesus. He came in and reached the tomb first, and he went in and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture, that he must rise from the dead. Again, this is an interesting insight here. They came in and they saw that the body was gone, and it says this disciple believed. But he didn't believe the same thing we believe. We know the end of the story. We know Jesus was raised, but they were confused. Mary told them that somebody had come and stolen the body of Jesus. You know, there are all kinds of reasons why why they might have been afraid somebody stole the body of Jesus. But they didn't understand. I think this is a curious insight here. What did he believe? It says to me that you don't have to see the body of Jesus to have faith. Have you ever seen the body of Jesus? Do you believe in resurrection? Yeah. So you don't have to see the body to believe in resurrection. So what did he understand? You know, faith isn't about understanding so much. I mean, there are things that we ought to try to understand. We want to try to understand. But faith isn't about your head. Faith is about your heart. Right? So believing comes before understanding. You know, he walked in and there was an empty tomb and he believed. What did he believe? He had to have some knowledge to come, some understanding to come later. But he first had an insight, an internal insight, and he believed. And then his understanding came later. Seems to me that we're not so far from those first disciples after all. You know, sometimes I hear people say, oh, wouldn't it be great if we lived back then when Jesus did it, we could see all of his miracles, and we could have been there when the disciples were there, and Mary was there, and see the resurrected Lord. You know, I'm not so sure that we don't have kind of the same access that they did. This disciple didn't see the resurrected body of Jesus, and he believed. You don't have to see the resurrected body of Jesus to believe. You don't have to understand everything to believe. Belief starts with the heart. Right? And then some understanding. But Mary stood outside the tomb weeping. Weeping. As she wept, she bent over to look in the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. And they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And she said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." She didn't understand. She didn't understand. One thing that we see in this part of the story is emotion. Here was a woman who loved Jesus. They had spent time together, as Jesus had spent with all of his disciples. Jesus, we see in the Gospels, we see oftentimes the very human nature of Jesus. He had friends and he loved them. But when Lazarus died, do you remember what they said? Jesus came and he was late, and Mary, the brother of Lazarus, was upset because Jesus was late. And she said, if you'd been here, he wouldn't have died. But what did Jesus do?
He didn't die, he was asleep.
He wept. Jesus wept because his friend had died. When Jesus was coming into Jerusalem that last time, he came in and he looked over Jerusalem. And the Bible says Jesus wept over the city. We see the emotion of Jesus. He was a human being who had emotions just like you do. He had friends just like we have friends. And those friendships led to emotions that we have. And when Lazarus died, Jesus wept. And when Jesus died, Mary wept. There was emotion there because that's what relationship does for us. Jesus, we see the human nature of Jesus and the emotion that he had. And when she had said this, she turned around and she saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't know it was Jesus. What does Jesus look like? You ever seen Jesus? You haven't?
I've seen his word.
Jesus said, when you have done it to the least of these, you have done it to me. When someone is naked and you give them clothes, when someone is hungry and you feed them, when someone's a stranger and you welcome them, when someone's in prison and you visit them, Jesus said, when you've done it to the least of these, you've done it unto me. Maybe you have seen Jesus. You just weren't paying attention. You know what I mean? One Sunday morning, years ago, I was coming to Park Road. I always get to church early, and I usually write my sermons on Sunday morning. I started doing this years ago, and I'd get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I'd go to church, and I'd write my sermon. It doesn't take me quite that long anymore, but I still go to church early on Sunday mornings and write my sermon. So it was about 4:30 on a Sunday morning years ago, and I stopped at the corner to get a cup of coffee before I went in. And there was a woman there, and she had stringy hair, a white woman, stringy hair, and she had on raggedy blue jeans. And she said, "Mister, can I have a ride?" And I thought, I don't know whether I need to be giving this woman a ride on a Sunday morning. I'm not sure that's the best thing for me to be doing on a Sunday morning. And so I turned her down, and I went in and I got my cup of coffee, and I got in the truck, and I went down the road, and I thought about Jesus. When you've done it to the least of these, you've done it to me. And I turned around, and I thought, maybe I need to give this woman a ride. What can it hurt? Maybe Jesus is calling me to give this woman a ride. And I got back there, and she was gone. And I thought, could have been Jesus. Maybe I missed him. Maybe we don't know. Maybe we're not always paying attention. And maybe Jesus is actually there, calling us to reach out. Calling us to do what we're supposed to do. Maybe it was Jesus that I missed that morning with long, stringy blonde hair and ragged blue jeans. And maybe Jesus needed my help, and I missed him that day. So Mary turned around and says Jesus was there, but she didn't recognize him. And Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? For whom are you looking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she still didn't have any idea it was Jesus. She still didn't understand in her head. She said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." She still didn't understand, even though the Bible tells us he had been telling them what was going to happen. She didn't understand. She thought somebody had come and taken the body away. And Jesus said to her, "Mary." She understood. She finally, her eyes were open, and she turned and she said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher, rabbi. Jesus called her by name, and just like that, she understood. She realized who she was talking to. There's that story about the Emmaus Road, after the crucifixion, after the resurrection, and the two, the friends are walking, and it says a stranger came and walked along with them, and they walked 7 miles from Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And it says the stranger didn't know anything about what had happened. And they're talking to him, talking to this stranger, and they didn't realize who it was. And the story about Emmaus says it was Jesus walking with them, and they didn't understand. And they got to the house, and they invited the stranger in. They'd been with him for 7 miles. How long does it take to walk 7 miles? About all day, you know. So they walked all day long with him, and they didn't understand. And they went in and they sat down to have dinner. And as they broke bread together, their eyes were open, and just like that, he was gone. And once again, they said, "We missed him. Why didn't I know it was Jesus?" Their eyes were open. And what does it take for our eyes to be open? You know, those mystical experiences, those spiritual experiences, when finally we go, "Oh my gosh, I should have realized that was him. He called my name, you know, and I'm too late. You know, I didn't realize it. I didn't see it until too late." It's a call for us to have our eyes open, to have our hearts open, to listen for Jesus calling our name wherever it comes. It might come in places you don't expect it. It probably will come in places you don't expect it. We got to be looking. We got to be open. And Jesus said to her, you know, she came, what was the first thing Mary wanted to do? Grab hold of her. And Jesus said, "Do not take hold of me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Jesus said, don't hold on to me. One of my preacher friends, I've got a number of friends, and we talk every week about what we're preaching about this Sunday. This morning, and this friend of mine who's a pastor in Canada is going to talk about this text, about Mary who wanted to come and hold on to Jesus. And he's going to talk about what do we need to let go of. Maybe we're trying to hold on to an old Jesus, an old idea of Jesus. Maybe we want to hold on to old prejudices. Maybe we want to hold on to old fears. Maybe we want to hold on to some old ideas. And Jesus said, don't hold on to me, because there's something new coming. Don't hold on to the old. Let that go. Resurrection means there's something new coming. So Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them he had said these things to her. Who was the first Christian missionary?
I'm sorry.
We normally say Paul was the first Christian missionary. Who was the first Christian missionary? Mary. She saw the resurrected Christ, and she went and told the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." Mary, a woman, was the first missionary. Again, who was the first one there? Mary. The woman was there. She was the first missionary. Again, we see the importance of the role of women in the life of Jesus and in the life of the church. Mary was the first missionary. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them, and he said to them, "Peace be with you." What is the message of the whole Bible? Peace. Peace. Yeah. What does God want for us? Peace. The Hebrew word is shalom. Peace. But shalom doesn't just mean the absence of war. We don't have a war going on in our nation right now, do we? Not a real war. Are we at peace? We're not at peace. We're not at peace. You don't have to be literally fighting someone to not be at peace. And shalom, peace, is more than the absence of war. So Jesus wants for us to have peace. I believe the whole message of the Bible, the whole hope of God for us, is that we might be at peace and that we might have peace. And that doesn't just mean that you're not, punching somebody, fighting somebody. It's deeper than that. It means that we can really seek the best for one another, that we can truly want the best for one another and work for the best for one another. And it starts with us. And so Jesus came to them and said, "Peace be with you." Amen. And after he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. And then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. And Jesus said to them again, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you. When he had said this, he breathed on them, and he said to them, receive the Holy Spirit. Now listen to this. If you forgive the sin of any, they are forgiven. And if you retain the sins of any, they are retained. Now, this is one of my favorite sermons, one of my favorite words in the whole Bible. Jesus breathed on the disciples, and he said to them, be at peace. And then he said, you have power. You have the power to forgive. You know, have you ever done something wrong and you needed the person that you offended to say, I forgive you? And when they won't say that, it's like you need that, right? There's a power in the word of forgiveness. We need to say to people, I love you. I forgive you. I forgive you. And Jesus said there's a power in that. You know, Roman Catholics take this very seriously. They practice confession. And they say before you can go to church and have Mass, you need to go to confession. Now, a lot of Protestants don't understand this, and they feel like that's kind of hocus pocus, you know, Catholic magic. You got to go talk to the priest and let the priest forgive you and all that stuff. And we say, the priest doesn't have any power to forgive us. Does the priest have any power to forgive you? Jesus says he does. Jesus says you do too. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. If you retain the sins of any, if you don't offer forgiveness, they are not forgiven. There's a power in the word of forgiveness. And Roman Catholics take this very seriously. And so they go sit down in the confessional booth, or they go sit down and talk with the priest, and they say, Father, forgive me. You know, here's what I've done. And the priest says, you are forgiven. Well, why do the Catholics believe that? Because Jesus said, if you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. You need to speak the word of forgiveness. You need to say to someone, you are forgiven. Every Sunday morning at our worship service at Park Road, we have a moment of confession, and we let people stop and reflect on their week. What is it that I did this past week? Do I need to seek forgiveness for? Do I need to try to do something better, you know? And we say every single morning after that quiet moment of confession, we say, you are loved. You are forgiven. So be at peace. We're trying to take seriously Jesus' words. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. So you remember that. Jesus has given you the power to forgive. And that's a real power. But Thomas, who was called the twin, I got 2 more sermons and then we're going to be done. Okay? But Jesus, Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12 was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, we have seen the Lord. But he said to them, Thomas said to them, unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe. Yeah. We call him Doubting Thomas. Yeah. But you know what I think Thomas was? I think Thomas was just serious about his discipleship. I think Thomas just wanted to know. He wanted to take seriously. He didn't want to take anybody's word for anything. You know, he wanted to see. He wanted to know for himself. Why do we put Thomas down as Doubting Thomas? He's just asking good questions. You know, he's just wanting to take his discipleship seriously. Why shouldn't we want to examine our faith like Thomas? Why shouldn't we want to ask the questions? Why shouldn't we want to push and probe and know? A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. There's that word again. And then he said to Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and place it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe. And Thomas answered him, my Lord and my God. Now let me ask you an interesting question. Did Thomas touch the wounds in Jesus' hands and his side? No. Mm-hmm. Thomas had said to the disciples, unless I see his hands, and unless I see his side, and unless I can reach out and touch them, I will not believe. And Jesus came to Thomas a week later, and he said, here I am. Here's my hands, and here's my side. Reach out and touch me. Did he touch him?
Yeah.
Doesn't say he touched him. Doesn't say he touched him. We assume that he touched him. But here's what it says. Jesus said to Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out with your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe. And Thomas answered him, my Lord and my God. Now what I think this means, I think Thomas didn't touch Jesus. Because I think he didn't need to touch him. You see, I think this is one of the supreme examples of faith. That, Thomas, who had said, I've got to have proof like this proof. And you know what happened to Thomas is he had a spiritual experience. And what he realized was, you know what? I don't need to have that kind of proof because all the proof I need is in my heart. And so now you have to read this carefully to hear this. Not everybody agrees with me. Some people says, what John meant was, of course, Thomas reached out and touched him. I think John, the gospel writer, gives us a lot of detail here. And I think if Thomas had reached out and touched him, I think the gospel writer of John would have said, and so Thomas reached out and placed his fingers in Jesus' hands and in his side, and then he believed. But that's not what John says. And I think this is important because can you reach out and touch Jesus physically? Can you reach out and put your hand in Jesus' side? You don't have that access. I don't have that access. Can you have faith? Yes. Yeah. You understand that touchable, tangible proof is not necessary. That's not what faith is about. Right? Again, it's about your heart. It's about a spiritual experience. Can you prove God exists?
No.
You can't prove God exists. Can you prove Jesus was raised from the dead?
No.
There is no touchable, tangible proof. The only proof you have is right here. Right? The only proof you have is right here. This is the proof of God. The community of faith is the proof of God. The proof of God is when you go out on the street and you reach out your hand and help your neighbor. The proof of God is when you go out there and you see Jesus with that long stringy hair and the ratty blue jeans and you pick her up and you take her and you do something for her. That's the only proof you got. That's the only proof you're ever going to have. You're not going to have that kind of proof because that's not what God's about. And so I think this is a powerful story because I think it puts us exactly where the first disciples were. Thomas came to this moment and he realized, I don't need physical proof. All I need is to believe. And I think we're at the same place. You're not going to get any physical proof today of the resurrection of Jesus. But I believe in resurrection. I believe that God is the power that brings life out of death, that brings order out of chaos, that brings light out of darkness. That's who God is. And I see that around me. I see that here. I see that throughout the week. That's all the proof I have. Today, we celebrate Easter. And the greatest miracle of Easter was not what happened to Jesus. Did you know that? The greatest miracle of Jesus is not what happened. The greatest miracle of Easter is not what happened to Jesus 2,000 years ago. It's what can happen to us today if we believe. The world isn't going to believe in the resurrection of Jesus unless you show that power. So the greatest miracle of Easter is what happens to us. So let us pray for that today. Thank you, God, for the Easter story that we can learn so much from. Thank you for Jesus and the change that he made in his disciples' life. Work that Easter miracle with us today, that we might believe with our hearts, and that we might go from this place, and we might be Jesus' hands and feet in this world, that we might raise up the brokenhearted, that we might lift up those who are down, that we might be the hands and feet of loving God in this world. Let us celebrate this day. Christ is risen. Let Christ be risen in us. And all God's people said, Amen. Amen. Happy Easter.
You guys know. Thank you. Where you gonna be up now? I'm gonna see my head out. I gotta give them some stuff out now. Yes, sir. How you doing?
Hi, my friend. How are you? All right. Good to see you. All right. Doing well. We need to talk about the raggedy Jim. Let's be honest. I don't know why your granddaughter was wild that way. Yeah. You got that wear them that way. Buy them that way. Why don't they? All right. There's some trouble in the front, all the way up here. We're always out. But we're all raised up. I had to wear them that way. Oh, okay. Right.
See my brother. How you doing? Put some of them on now. No, it ain't gonna be double. It's round.
Thank you.
You welcome.
Thank you, my brother.
Happy Easter.
Happy Easter.
Happy Easter. God bless you. Pastor,
Happy Easter.
before you go,
my friend.
Yes, sir.
Happy
you touch it. You had me right on. You had my head going back here like this. He did.
He did.
He did. But then when you start listening to the reason, he did.
Yeah.
That's when assumption comes in. We assume because of what Christ said. But I got a wholehearted. Oh man, I appreciate that. I'm gonna use that.
All right. Good. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Happy Easter.
Happy Easter to you.
Miss White, I got you. I got you now. I'm gonna need you to help me. Yeah, the whole time it was sitting over there. You see you the whole time.